The United States was founded as a constitutional representative democracy and is considered the first modern one in the world. The forefathers developed it to work for everyone. While the frameworks for their creation are still intact, a lot has changed in the last 247 years, and American politics has become extremely polarizing. Is the American geopolitical system broken, or is it just going through an upgrade phase? Let's find out. The American colonies were influenced by British political traditions, notably the concept of a constitutional monarchy where the rule of law and individual rights were upheld. As the colonies grew, they developed their own assemblies, such as the Virginia House of Burgesses, which were based on representative principles. Enlightenment ideas profoundly influenced American leaders. Thinkers like John Locke argued for a government based on popular sovereignty and the protection of individual rights, ideas that found fertile ground among colonists who felt increasingly alienated by British rule. Prior to independence, the colonies had experienced various degrees of self-rule and were accustomed to managing their own affairs. However, policies such as the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts imposed by the British Parliament without local representation sparked outrage among the colonists, summarized in the slogan, "No taxation without representation." This experience underscored the importance of a representative government. The geographic size and diverse interests of the 13 colonies made a centralized direct form of democracy impractical. A representative system allowed for effective governance that could balance the varied interests of different regions and economic groups. The U.S. Constitution, drafted in 1787, was a product of compromise and innovation. It established a system of government with the separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and included mechanisms such as checks and balances to prevent the concentration of power. The Federalist Papers, a series of essays by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued for the ratification of the Constitution by emphasizing how the proposed government would be both effective and protective of freedoms. The constitutional representative democracy that emerged was designed to ensure both liberty and order, drawing from lessons of history and the practical needs of a new nation. This model has worked extremely well for the last 2 centuries, despite some road bumps such as the American Civil War. But in recent decades, American politics has become very different, such as more dividing and polarizing. In fact, it seems that America is more divided than ever, with disagreements about virtually all domestic and international matters. It seems that there is no more compromise between political parties, as well as amongst citizens to debate these topics. What happened to bipartisanship and cooperation? It's a complicated subject matter. Early on in American politics, there were more distinct political parties than the 2 major ones the U.S. has today, the Democratic and Republican parties. In many of the 19th century presidential races, it wasn't uncommon to have more than 2 major candidates running, and many times, these other parties would win a state's electoral votes. Near the start of the U.S. Civil War, the newly formed Republican Party against slavery formed, which evolved from the defunct Whig Party. By the late 1860s, American politics started to transition slowly into a 2-party Democrat-Republican system, with either-or candidate usually receiving the state's electoral votes. But there were still a few more presidential elections that had third-party candidates receiving electoral votes. In the 1892 election, Eugene Weaver, a candidate of the pro-agrarian Populist Party, won the rural states of Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, Kansas, and North Dakota. Afterwards, the Populist Party merged with the Democratic Party. In the 1912 election, 4 candidates vied for the presidency, including Progressive Party candidate and previous Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, who ran against Republican William Howard Taft. Roosevelt felt that the Republican Party had changed ideological principles under Taft's presidency, which is why he ran, winning 6 states and Taft only winning 2. However, Democrat Woodrow Wilson pulled 40 states, winning the election. Ultimately, the Progressive Party merged back into the Republican Party in 1920. In the 1924 election, Robert M. Lafayette created a new progressive party which allowed him to run for the presidency. This progressive party was like the populist party Eugene Weaver ran as in 1892, being pro-agrarian. Lafayette went on to win Wisconsin, but Republican Calvin Coolidge won the election by a landslide. In the mid to later 20th century, other third-party candidates were mostly associated with Southern politics, with the first of those being in 1948, when previous Democrat and segregationist Strom Thurmond ran as a candidate for the state's rights Democratic Party, an offshoot party of the Democrats. Thurmond did win 4 states in the South, but Democrat Harry Truman won the election. The last election where a third-party candidate won states was in 1968, when Alabama Governor George Wallace, a segregationist, carried 5 southern states. From the 1970s to the early 2010s, all presidential elections were battled out between Democrats and Republicans. And astoundingly, politics became surprisingly tame, especially during the 1980s and 1990s. Along with the tameness, bipartisanship between the two parties was common. The only small deviation from this was during the 1992 presidential election, when independent candidate and businessman Ross Perot received 19.7 million votes, the highest ever for a third-party candidate. However, he received no electoral votes and won no state. The first turn towards polarization in American politics was after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. On October 26, 2001, the Patriot Act was passed by the Senate and House. The act significantly expanded the U.S. government's surveillance and investigative powers to combat terrorism. It allowed for increased monitoring of communications, easier access to personal records, and enhanced law enforcement capabilities. But also was a cause for concern about Americans losing personal freedoms. In the House, 66 representatives voted against the act, with 63 being Democrats and 3 being Republicans. One of the Republicans was Ron Paul, a Libertarian. But in the Senate, 98 out of 100 senators voted for the Patriot Act, with only one holdout, Democrat Russ Feingold, who voted against it. A year later, in 2002, Congress passed a bill to invade Iraq, ultimately culminating in the invasion of the nation in March of 2003, with extremely strong support from the George W. Bush administration. This time, more House members, 133 to be exact, voted against authorization, including 127 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and in the Senate, 77 senators voted for authorization, while 23 didn't, with only 1 Republican voting that way. The invasion of Iraq was initially backed by many Americans, but by the late 2000s, support started to wane due to the loss of life of American armed force members, the cost of the war itself, and protest over the conflict. This conflict, along with other socioeconomic problems, including the Great Recession, allowed Barack Obama, a young senator from Illinois, to win the 2008 presidential election, beating out former First Lady and Senator Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries and defeating Republican John McCain, a strong proponent of the Iraq War. Also, Obama was the first president of African American descent, which was an American milestone. While Obama's tenure as president was unique, his administration was seen as pretty mainstream on the political spectrum. The last mundane presidential election was the 2012 one, where Obama defeated Republican Mitt Romney. But things were about to take a very dramatic shift. In June of 2015, businessman and entertainment personality Donald Trump announced his run as a Republican for the 2016 election. His main political speaking point revolved around illegal immigration and wanting to stop it. At first, his campaign was seen as an outlier that wouldn't be able to compete with mainstream Republican candidates such as Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. But somehow, Trump started to inch up in the polls through mid to late 2015, and by the time the 2016 Republican primaries rolled around, he was a frontrunner. In May of 2016, Trump won the Republican nomination, but on the Democrat side, things were also interesting. Hillary Clinton, once again, ran for the presidency, and initially many believed there wasn't much competition. However, Bernie Sanders, a socialist Democrat, ran and did win 23 of the 57 primary contests, a fairly high number of them. This was one of the first signals of Democrats choosing an outsider over an establishment candidate, but in the end, Clinton grasped the nomination. Towards the latter part of 2016, many political analysts said that Clinton was going to win the election. In fact, some predictions showed she had a 97% chance of winning. On November 8th, voters went to the polls, and by the middle of the night of November 9th, there was a unique shift in the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. For the first time since 1984 for Wisconsin and 1988 for Michigan and Pennsylvania, the electoral votes went to a Republican. These wins in these states gave Trump a total of 304 electoral votes over Clinton's 227. However, Clinton won the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. But since the U.S. is a representative democracy, not a direct democracy, the Electoral College is what counts. Donald Trump was the first president elected with no past political or military experience, which was seen as voting in someone who wasn't part of the establishment. During Trump's tenure as president, much of his political ideologies were considered populist, including both domestic and international policies. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world and caused a lot of socioeconomic effects, including in the U.S. This pandemic, coupled with protests and riots associated with George Floyd during the summer of 2020, did decrease Trump's popularity, which resulted in establishing Democratic candidate Joe Biden winning the 2020 election. Fast forward to 2024, another presidential election is coming up between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who secured the Republican nomination on March 12th. This election is seen as one of the most unconventional presidential elections in political history, and right now, polls do have Trump ahead in many key battleground states, once again signaling a shift to the non-establishment. Only a decade or so ago, the geopolitical American arena was made of mostly establishment career politicians or even political legacies. Notable current or previous establishment career politicians included Robert Byrd, a previous U.S. Senator from West Virginia, Nancy Pelosi, a House member from California, Mitch McConnell, a U.S. Senator from Kentucky, and current U.S. President Joe Biden, who previously was a U.S. Senator from Delaware and Vice President under Barack Obama. Another career politician, Bernie Sanders, was previously a Democratic congressman and now a U.S. Senator from Vermont, but unlike the others, he isn't considered an establishment politician, considering his differing domestic and international ideologies. Political families are represented on both sides of the aisle. The most notable political legacies are the Kennedy family, Democrats, and the Bush family, Republicans. Both families produced U.S. presidents, vice presidents, senators, congressmen, and governors. While political families usually produce establishment candidates, there is an outlier in the Kennedy family, Robert F. Kennedy, who is running as an independent in the 2024 presidential election. His views have been a mixture of progressive and populist policies. With that being said, Kennedy is polling around 9%, the highest since Ross Perot's independent run in 1992. It most likely means that he will not win the election, but he will take votes away from both Biden and Trump. When it comes to the political establishment, some do think that these politicians have been in politics too long and are not doing anything to better their constituents' lives. This has been the main reason why there has been more of a shift to outsiders. Yet, outsiders may be the ones who have polarized and broken the framework for American politics. The polarization in American politics has always been there, but in this day and age, it seems worse than ever. Domestic and global issues are driving the furthering division of politics. An example would be social issues such as abortion. Abortion was initially federally legalized in 1973 after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Politically, it was a closed issue. But by the late 2010s, more far-right candidates were elected to the Senate and Congress, creating a debate over abortion's legality. Also, during Donald Trump's presidency, he appointed 3 conservative justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Ultimately, in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, meaning abortion was no longer legalized at the federal level, thus allowing states to make their own decisions on the matter. Since then, the topic of abortion has created tensions between people who are pro-choice and pro-life. The fact of the matter is that the abortion issue will never be compromised because both sides are incredibly divided. Global issues have been at the forefront of division within American politics. 2 conflicts, the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war, have created hostilities in America. With Ukraine, establishment Democrats and Republicans support sending aid and weapons to the nation to assist in trying to win the war. But some politicians, especially ones on the far right, are against these measures. In terms of the Israel-Hamas war, protests and riots have erupted in support of freeing Palestine, and many of those people are far left politically. In fact, many of the same protesters were associated with other domestic problems, such as the 2020 George Floyd protests and riots, which led to certain cities defunding police departments. The COVID-19 pandemic also opened up the polarization of politics. Lockdowns and the initial closure of America led to protests of these measures, along with others such as face masks, most of whom were opposed by conservatives. When the COVID-19 vaccine started to be administered to Americans, mandates were put into effect by certain jurisdictions, and this led to tensions among people who were vaccinated and ones who didn't want it. Generally, the Democrats supported vaccine mandates, while the Republicans, especially the Libertarian faction of it, and sole Libertarians not connected to the Republican Party, didn't. The geopolitical future of America is uncertain. While the Democratic and Republican parties will still be the major ones, there is a possibility that new offshoot parties will pop up. There are ideological differences between politicians of the same parties. Currently, the Democratic Party has many different internal factions, including moderate Democrats, considered the most conservative, liberal Democrats, considered the establishment of the party, and the far-left Democrats. The far-left Democrats are considered to be the ones that likely would create a new political party altogether. Politicians such as Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar are examples of this faction within the current Democrat Party. Ideologically, they're pro-choice, for gay rights, strong believers in man-made climate change, pro-Palestine, pro-immigration, both legal and illegal, and skeptical or fully against funding police departments. On the Republican side, there are several factions of that party, including neoconservatives, moderate conservatives, and far-right conservatives, some labeled as MAGA conservatives due to their support of Donald Trump. Historically, the U.S. government had many neoconservatives, including George W. Bush and his presidential administration. Neoconservatives, ideologically, are for democracy, but are for intervening in foreign affairs, such as international wars and conflicts, similarly to some liberal Democrats. Pretty much, them and the liberal Democrats are considered the establishment. Outside of that realm, far-right Republicans are considered outsiders, but their movement has grown in recent years. Politicians such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, and Donald Trump are examples of this faction within the current Republican Party. Ideologically, they're generally pro-life, for isolationism and non-interventionism, against immigration, especially illegal immigration, and critics of other issues such as climate change and green energy. Pretty much, they're the polar opposites of the far left. Yet, both the far left and the far right are gaining support of Americans, which is deteriorating support for the establishment politicians. Ultimately, these factions on the far left and right may break apart from the Democrats and Republicans, thus creating new parties. But if you think the division is extreme now, it may become even worse with that hypothetical scenario. Heading further into the 21st century, American politics is only going to become more polarizing. While new ideas and ideological viewpoints bring differences, these differences may be too extreme or contradictory. This pretty much will create a large division in Congress, and with that, no progress will be implemented to fix the actual problems and issues plaguing the United States. The reality of it is that American politics may be broken, considering that the establishment politicians are not for the people, and outsider politicians are too extreme on both sides. Compromise and negotiation are desperately needed to come up with actual solutions that will help the United States. Optimistically, it may happen eventually, but we're far away from that day. Do you think that the American political system is broken? I'd love to hear your opinion about it, so leave your feedback in the comment section below. That concludes today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll like the other content on my channel, so be sure to subscribe to my channel, Our World, Our Planet, Our Home. Until next time!